Good morning, everybody. What is up, and welcome back. If you're new here, I'm Liz, your host here, Crimes Untold, or if you're listening over on Spotify, Untold Crimes. So today we're actually going to be talking about the famous chorus girl mystery, or chorus girl murder. We're going to be talking about the murder of Mamie Stuart. And you probably guessed it. This is another oldie case. This is going back to 1919. No, I'm not kidding. But this is a case in which we're going to Wales. I haven't really talked about cases that are in Wales, but this one does. So who was Mamie Stuart? Well, Mamie Stuart was born back on November 24th of 1893 in Sunderland, England. She was the daughter to James Stuart and Jane McGregor. Her father was a ship captain and her mother was probably a homemaker. Now, she had one sister and she also had a younger brother, Edith and James. When she was younger, she loved to dance and she would perform perform in the music halls that were in the West End theaters. And eventually, after time, her parents would come to agree to allow her to perform. So at the age of 15, they gave their consent for her to perform as a chorus girl on one of the tours in a troupe for the Magnets. This is a provincial tour that she was allowed to go on with this group. And this is where she actually adopted the name Mamie. Her name was Amy Stewart at birth. And later, after this tour, she would pursue her career as acting and dancing and singing. She then would perform in her own dance troupe following the Magnets, and she named this the Five Verona Girls. This troupe would perform all over England, and it became extremely popular. And it became popular in a time known as the Prudish era. So, the Prudish era is where people were very sensitive to different things, where they expected women to be modest and respectable. And when you're a dancer, you're not always modest and respectable. They also would expose their legs to about the knee height. So typically speaking in this era, your legs would be fully covered. For them, they weren't. It is also very well known that she was a very attractive woman. She had gray blue eyes. She was about 5'3" in height, maybe 5'4". She was very tall, and a lot of source material says she's of good carriage. So I believe that her body was of good stature. Obviously, if she's a dancer, her body would be toned in a certain way. She also had bobbed hair, like short bobbed brown hair as well. And she, at a young age, actually was attacked by a dog, and she had tooth marks on her right cheek that you could probably see like scar marks. And it was four different tooth marks that are on her right cheek, and she would oftentimes cover it with makeup so nobody could see it. Well, unfortunately, in early of 1917, while she was still a member of the Five Verona Girls, she ended up becoming pregnant, and she broke her ankle. Or another broke her ankle. Shortly after this all happened, she became pregnant, another member broke their ankle. This group broke up, and Mamie ended up returning home. Shortly after returning home in July of 1917, she met a man named George Shotton. George Shotton was a marine engineer that was from Sunderland. He introduced himself as a widower, and they soon became very enamored with each other. He then purchased a diamond ring for her within a few months of them meeting. Everything moved extremely fast. And less than a year after meeting, they married in South Shields. After they got married, they ended up going on their honeymoon to the Droitwich Spa. So, the Droitwich Spa is a historic spa that's in Worcestershire, England, which is on the River Salwarp, and it's southwest of Birmingham and northeast of Worcester. After their honeymoon, they would reside in Bristol before moving to Swansea, and they ended up living in Trafalgar Terrace for about 6 months. Following this, they then moved to Caswell Bay, Wales, in the late summer of 1990, and they would live in a remote cottage that would look over the Swansea Bay. And this is named the Tylenwind? Tylenwind. I'll put the word on the screen if you're watching on YouTube so you could see it. She would maintain regular writings to her family, and so they would be in contact with her. Now, not known to Mamie, Stuart's wife, Mary, whom he married in 1905, was actually still alive. You see, he introduced himself as a widower, but his first wife was still quite alive. They together, Stuart and Mary, had a son named Arthur, and their relationship was not good. It was extremely violent. He would beat his wife. He would beat his wife so much to the point that his wife, Mary, and their child, they lived in Penarth. Mary thought that his job brought him away for extended periods of time. That's why he was absent from the family for so long. She had no idea that he married somebody else. So Mamie was last seen in either November or December of 1919. In a few of the letters that she sent prior to her disappearance, it seemed like things were not happy. Her marriage was not good. He was becoming extremely violent, and she wanted to leave. He refused to allow her to return to being a chorus girl, which is what she loved doing. The final letter that she wrote to her parents was dated on November 12th of November. I just said November 12th of November. So November 12th of 1919. And in this letter, it basically stated more of the want and desire to leave her husband. Shortly after this, her parents then replied, but the letter was returned to them with a marking on it saying house closed. They thought it was an error, so they then replied to the paid telegram to Mamie, but this was also returned to them with the same marking. So fast forward to Christmas time of 1919, there was a telegram that was sent to Mamie's parents, apparently from Mamie, wishing them compliments of the season. Kind of weird, or basically just saying Merry Christmas. There was nothing else sent to her parents, no other correspondence from supposed Mamie to her parents or from Stuart after this. So in March of 1920, a noted leather trunk was left at the Swansea Grosvenor's Hotel. And this was left by a male guest in December of 1919. It wasn't claimed. It was literally there for 3 months. There was no address tag on it. So what they decided to do was the manager of the Grosvenor Hotel ended up contacting the police, who opened the trunk. And in the trunk, they discovered a pair of shoes and two women's dresses. All of them were completely torn and cut. They also found jewelry, a rosary, a manicure set, and a Bible in this as well. There was also scrap paper in this trunk. And in this trunk, it had the address of Mamie Stuart's parents. Mamie Stuart's parents informed investigators that their daughter had been missing. They hadn't heard from her since November of 1919, or supposedly December of 1919, and that they had been trying to find her over the last few months. They didn't know where she was. They were afraid for her. They were afraid for her safety, especially with what she was saying about Stuart. They also gave all the letters they received from her to the police from the prior year, which showed them how unhappy she was with her husband and her fear of her well-being. Recently, they obtained a letter from Mamie weeks prior to her disappearance. So this is the last letter that they heard from her, and in which it speaks, "Please wire to Mrs. Hearn and see if she knows anything about me. The man is not all there. I don't think I will live with him much longer. My life is not worth living." It starts with, "If you don't hear from me." So it's kind of suicide note-esque, but not really. Investigators then would discover that in the letters to her parents, obviously indicating the abuse that she was experiencing, her desire to stop living with him, and that there was something odd about him. Soon after this, a maid that ended up cleaning the deserted cottage, she prepared the cottage for a new tenant, and this is when they discovered Mammy's brown leather handbag concealed behind a dresser that was in the bedroom upstairs. This this handbag was mildewed, like the start of mold. Like there's fungus forming on it. You could clearly see like it's got black and blue shades on it. It's just been sitting there. And in this, it contained 2 pounds in loose change and also a sugar ration card that was Mammy's. So within the spring of 1920, this is when South Wales police ended up contacting Scotland Yard. Scotland Yard was contacted, and the chief inspector at the time, William Draper, ended up overseeing this investigation. So it's believed that Mamie was murdered at the hands of her husband, Stuart Shotton, and most likely the motive for him to murder her was jealousy, rage, a mix of control, jealousy, and rage. Inspector Draper would have a search done of the grounds of the property and the terrain that surrounded it, but there wasn't a trace of her, unfortunately. There was a nationwide search for her ordered as well, with her description circulating around the United Kingdom, but there was no leads whatsoever. They were pretty quick to assume that Stuart Shotton was actually George Shotton, and with this, he was the prime suspect. South Wales Police and Scotland Yard automatically assumed that he was the prime suspect. They ended up locating him while he was living in Penarth with his wife and his child, mere 2 miles from Thailandwood. He Shotton admitted to knowing Mamie Stuart and leaving the trunk at the hotel, and he claimed he had done this shortly after she left him when they had an argument in December in 1919. He said that she was unfaithful to him, and infidelity is why they left. He denied the fact that he married her and denied knowing where she was, even though it was revealed that he had married Mamie almost 2 years prior to this, and he was committing bigamy. He also denied doing this and said that Mamie walked out on him. He had chosen to go back to his wife. And when Scotland Yard contacted Mrs. Hearn, the one that is said or spoken of in the letter from Mamie, she then confirmed that Mamie was at the hands of George Shotton, basically meaning that she was in a severely domestic abusive marriage, and that Mamie said to her, begged her, "If I am ever missing, do your utmost to find me, won't you?" It's the saddest thing I've ever read. One of the saddest things I have ever read. Police would continue to try and find her body, but they were unable to actually charge him with Mamie Stuart's murder. And at the time, law prevented a suspect from being tried for murder if there was no body, unfortunately. So even though they were convinced of his guilt, by the mid-20s, the investigators of Scotland Yard began to refer to this case as the perfect crime. Unfortunately for George Shotton, because he had married Mamie Stuart on the 25th of March in 1918 in South Shields, he then could be charged with bigamy. He then was arrested on May 29th of 1920 with the offense of bigamy, and it brought him to trial 2 months later in Glamorgan Assize. He pled not guilty, claimed that although he had known to be living with Mamie, he then said that somebody assumed his identity to marry her. He also denied being abusive to her, repeating what he said prior, that they had parted ways, which is clearly not the case, and that they parted ways during a fight in early December of 1919. There was many individuals that testified at the trial stating that they were indeed married and that their marriage at the beginning was very happy. One person even said, which this person actually was Edith, Mamie's sister, she testified that George frequently referred to Mamie as his own little wife and typically signed any letters from him, like that he wrote, stating, "Your own loving husband." What a schmuck. So during this bigamy trial, he was openly accused of doing away with Mamie, but because of the absence of her body, they couldn't prove anything. So on July 13th, he then was sentenced to serve 18 months in prison with hard labor for bigamously marrying Mamie Stuart. Shortly after he was released from jail, his actual wife then divorced him. What a smart lady. So following all of these, you could probably assume that this case kind of went cold, or that there were sightings, possible sightings. So following the bigamy conviction, there was alleged sightings of Mamie all over the place. You're talking South Africa, you're talking Australia, India, Canada, all of the above. One reported sighting of her was made by a chief officer of the cargo ship Blythemore. This man's name is Thomas James. He said that there was a close Thomas James was actually a close friend to Mamie Stuart's father. He claimed that he saw her at the portal town of Karachi in the early 1920s when she was a part of a troupe of English travelers known as the Karachi Theater. When he was approached by Thomas James, there was a woman that ended up denying, saying that she was Stuart, and then she walked away. However, he was very adamant that the woman he'd spoken to was Mamie Stuart. This was disproven. So back in 1950, so the cottage that George and Mamie resided in at the time of her disappearance was purchased by a dentist. While doing some drainage work on the property, this is when they would discover something. They would discover something at the rear of the house, close to a hole in the foundation, which would be beneath the floorboards of the dining room. This pit was filled with quicklime, and all that was recovered from this pit was one lady's shoe. Interesting, right? Interesting. So we're gonna jump forward to 1961. So 42 years after Mamie's disappearance, on the 5th of November of 1961, remains were discovered rotting in a sack behind a large stone slab that was about 50 feet down a lead mine in Brandy Cove in Caswell. 3 young men named Graham Jones, Chris McNamara, and John Girk discovered these remains. This body was concealed 200 yards from the home that indeed was shared between Mamie and, you guessed it, George. One of these men, John Girk, would later state that they had chosen to explore this area as it was formerly known to be used by smugglers, and that as they worked together to explore this ventilation shaft, the route through this narrow tunnel, about 10 feet in length, was blocked by a large stone. When they pulled the slab aside, this is when they found a skull. John then turned to face a friend and realized that it was human. Nearby was a black, like celluloidish, which celluloid is basically like a nitrocellulose and camphor mixed group of material that just happens with age. This clump of hair, still containing mid-brown hair, and some jewelries, and even a 7-inch brass chain was just found with several scraps of clothing. Like, it was just a hunk of remains. Obviously, they would inform the police, and what would happen is that the remains would be taken to a laboratory in Cardiff where they would examine them. And these remains were examined by two pathologists, John Griffiths and William James. The bones were then reassembled into a complete skeleton, of which, minus the rib cage, belonged to a female in between the heights of 5'3" and 5'4", and had one canine tooth extracted from her upper jaw. This is something I did not tell you guys about on purpose. 3 of her wisdom teeth were obviously present at the time, and it is believed that she was over the age of 20. An x-ray showed that there was growth areas of her bones, revealed that this was a fully mature woman. But the complete maturation of her bones, which full maturity, they weren't able to deduce how fully mature she was at the time. But what they were able to deduce is that the 2 bones at the base of her skull had recently fused. So this was likely that this woman was over 28 years of age. Sections of her bone were green stained due to the copper from her brass jewelry. So as copper tarnishes or brass tarnishes, some of the coating of it will stain things. Copper and brass are known to tarnish in a green or bluish tone, so any runoff that is in this pit that would hit this brass jewelry then would run off onto any remains. I just know that from basic physical science classes. There was no cause of death that could be determined at the time when they found these remains. They also were unable to discount strangulation or stabbing during the autopsy. The actual description of the remains and the location of their recovery matched that of Mamie Stuart. Although the remains were completely of skeletal finding, the scraps of clothing and the footwear, plus the jewelry, indicated that she most likely, this is where she most likely died, or she was brought here while she was dying. There is a museum, or the museum that would begin to be associated with this case. Then we're able to confirm that the stole tassels, so tassels is on the clothing, and stole is just a simple piece of clothing. So very simple gilt copper stole that she's wearing was very fashionable in 1920. And they also then were able to date the diamond engagement ring that was found on the remains as well. This was a gold wedding diamond ring, and indicating that the death was between 1912 and 1918, or the ring was made between 1912 and 1918. The death likely occurred in the years immediately after World War I, noting the age of the ring. A close friend of Mamie Stuart ended up identifying both rings belonging to Mamie. This was an older, elderly woman that was a close friend of Mamie. After the discovery of these remains, this is when Interpol began to locate George Shotton. George Shotton was located 3 weeks after the discovery of the remains, and he actually died 3 years prior to the remains being found. He was found in Bristol's Arnos Cemetery. He died at the age of 77 on the 30th of April of 1958. He had no money, lived his final years in a home for elderly people after he had a stroke, and he died in Bristol's Southmead Hospital. Shortly prior to his death, or after to his death, he was buried in an unmarked grave, or pauper's grave, that just had his welfare number on it. His first wife was still alive at the time. She was questioned and confirmed that her prior husband was extremely violent And when his temper came out, he you had no idea what he was going to do. He was an adulterer. He committed bigamy against her, and she believed that he was guilty of murdering Mamie Stuart, and believed that even though she remained missing for that period of time, she believed that he did, in fact, kill her and hid her remains. And that the murder of Mamie, the disappearance of Mamie, him being bigamous, that all was the culmination leading up to their ultimate divorce. Following her divorce from him, she never saw him again, or even if she did see him, she didn't want to see him, and that he never confessed his guilt to her. There was a formal inquest into Mamie Stuart's death that was held on the 14th of December of 1961, and throughout the proceedings, her skeleton was actually on a table in the courtroom so people could see. The actual autopsy was able to conclude that her body was severed in 3 equal parts. One was through the humerus at the midsection. This was made with an instrument used to dissect her body, also severing the lower shoulder blades at her spine. There also was a cut on her lower femur just above her knees as well. The person that killed her had a very hard time severing her body, as multiple different bones had striations or identifying markers or indentations showing that this person didn't know what they were doing and had a hard time cutting through her bones. None of her rib cage was ever recovered at this scene, though. That was the only part of her bones that they couldn't find. Obviously, to assist with identifying her, they then would superimpose a photograph on the skull, and over this was a portrait of Mamie that was taken during her performing days. And they then were able to prove that this was indeed Mamie Stuart. There also was a question that was asked of the jury for the coroner stating, "Can you imagine any reason for sawing up anyone if the person had committed suicide or if the death was accidental?" At the end of the inquest, this is when the retired postman at the time, William Simons, that he delivered mail to this cottage. He was the one that would deliver mail, and that in December of 1919, he saw George Shotton with a large sack in the back of a yellow van that was parked outside the gate of the cottage. And according to him, he offered him help with the load, but George freaked out and said, "No, no, 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 no. You gave me a fright. I thought you were a police officer." And basically stating that he didn't need any help. This is when Simons then would watch George Shotton put this in the van and saw him drive in the direction of Brandy Cove. So he literally saw him. Furthermore, they believe that Mamie Stuart had obviously died via murder. They don't know exactly when. They just believe that she died anywhere between November 12th and December 6th of 1919, and that George Shotton is the guilty party. I will say, to be fair, or to be nicely said, they did bury her in Bishop Wearmouth's cemetery in Sunderland in December of 2019. Why it took so long, I don't know, but I think more or less it's because they were studying them. It does take some time for skeletal remains to be released to the family. It also says, too, that there was a pathologist at a lab that retained the remains, even though he wanted to dispose of them, in hopes of trying to find a surviving member of her family to claim them. Mamie Stuart's great niece, Susan Oldnall, discovered the whereabouts of her great aunt's remains in 2019, and this is how she retained the remains and then was able to bury them. so she would be interred with her family. There was only 4 members of her family that were at the service at the burial, which is slightly sad, but I'm sure that not a lot of her family was alive at the time, which is deeply saddening. So to backtrack just a little bit, the reason why I didn't tell you anything about the tooth is because I wanted you guys to see that's an identifying marking that happened to her when she was younger. One of her teeth had to be removed. Is it, where is it? Yeah, she had very even teeth and one missing. That is something that happened to her when she was younger, and she needed to have that tooth removed. I couldn't find why, but she needed to have that one tooth removed. Maybe it's so, or maybe it just never grew in. It is a quite possibility that that is what happened. You never know. But that, my friends, is the chorus girl mystery, the murder of the chorus girl, the perfect crime, the murder of Mamie Stuart. I hope you all learned something from this, and I'll see you guys in my next one.